Okay, so this is kind of where we left off. This is the mausoleum of Galla Placidia in Ravenna, Italy, and it's definitely a structure that has two crossed arms. And inside, or in the where they actually cross, we can see there's a tower. And these are such short arms that the tower is definitely emphasized, and there is a dome on the interior of this tower as well once you move inside. Um, this building really represents the earliest fusions of the longitudinal plan, oftentimes used for basilican churches at this point, and also the central plan, which was used for baptistries and mausoleums. So it's kind of a fusion of the longitudinal and the central plan, and it's one of the earlier examples of that. And this actually becomes a really popular building type as we move forward in time in Christian architecture. And so just remember that this is kind of one of the first examples of that fusion. And it's basically a longitudinally planned building with a domed crossing. And St. Peter's would eventually assume this form in the 17th century when it's remodeled. So it is going to become a very important building type in Christian history, basically, in the history of Christian architecture. So the outside is brick. That's very typical of this period. There are glass mosaics inside. They're very decorative if we take a look at those. This is the interior of the mausoleum. And it has these really fanciful, detailed garlands. There's some snowflake-shaped medallions on a dark blue background. It's very beautiful. It kind of reminds me of Islamic art, actually, with just the amount of decoration and detail that they have in these glass mosaics. So we'll actually take a look at a detail from the north wall around the entrance of the mausoleum of Galla Placidia, and it's Christ as a Good Shepherd. And this is definitely a popular subject in early Christian funerary art, Christ as a Good Shepherd, but instead of carrying a lamb, he's actually appearing among his flock. And he is robed in like a gold and purple robe, which definitely signifies that he's a very important person. Only special people wore purple at this time because it was very expensive to make purple dye, to dye clothing. So that's kind of a signal to the viewers that he's important, right? That he's wearing purple. And as you can see, the figures are still quite naturalistic. They're shaded. You can see the sheep have shading in their bodies. The proportions are quite natural. So we're still seeing that classical style of Rome and Greece being passed down, and it's still present in the art of this early Christian piece that we're looking at here. So next up, we'll look at the interior of a different building. Actually, it's Sant'Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, Italy. It's also located in Ravenna, Italy. The year is it's actually 495 through 504. So this is made 30 years after the last piece that we looked at, or the last building that we looked at, the Galla Placidia. So this Sant'Apollinare is a little bit, younger by 30 years than the last building we looked at. Definitely still located in Ravenna, Italy. And Theodoric, the king of the Ostrogoths, established Ravenna as the capital in 493. So what's pictured here in this slide is essentially his palace church. He actually built this with an extensive series of mosaics, and there's Hebrew prophets, the scenes of, the life of Christ are definitely included in these mosaics. Originally, this was a three-aisled basilica type church, and it was dedicated to our Lord Jesus Christ, but it was rededicated in the 9th century, so that's a lot later on, to Saint Apollinare Nuovo, which is what its name is still to this day. And it was only rededicated because they acquired relics from the Saint Apollinaris. So once they got those relics, they changed the name of the church and dedicated it to Saint Sant'Apollinare Nuovo. So we'll take a look at a couple of the mosaics inside in more detail. This is the baptism of Christ. There's some altar tables, some thrones, the 12 apostles. And this is in the dome of the Orthodox baptistry. And in the interior, you can see, this is probably Jesus with the holy dove. Not sure who this is. That might be God. They don't really say what that is. So this is one of the original pieces from the church that Theodoric built, and it's unchanged from his time. It's basically the baptism of Christ, and it is located in the dome of the baptistry. And you can see the 12 apostles with Christ at the center. Hebrew patriarchs and prophets stand between the clerestory windows, which we can't really see in this slide very well. So there are clerestory windows. They let in light. They illuminate those glass mosaics. They really make them sparkle. And above the clerestory windows, we'll take a look at another scene from Christ's lives. It's a decorative panel. It's one of the original pieces from Theodoric's time. It's called the Miracle of Loaves and Fishes. It's the top register of the nave wall above the clerestory windows. That's where it's located. We're still in the Apollinare Nuovo church here. And yeah, it's a lot different than the mosaics of Gala Placidia that we looked at. And so we're seeing some different Christian iconographies here. It's evolving. So Jesus is still pictured as beardless because it is kind of an early piece. He is in gold and purple, which is, much like the other piece that we saw, but now he's distinguished by a cross-inscribed nimbus or a halo. So there's kind of this cross shape nimbus, which is a halo, another word for a halo. And that signifies his divinity, and he is facing directly towards the viewer, and he has his arms extended. And in this piece, he's actually telling his disciples to hand out the bread that he is, and the fish, that he's miraculously, through the act of miracle, having those things appear, and they're feeding all these hungry people. And it's one of the important, major stories from the Bible. And they think that Peter and Andrew are on Jesus's left, and the young man to his right is probably John the Evangelist. So this piece does show still some classical naturalism and late antique abstraction mixed together. So another thing that sets this piece apart is that it does have the addition of the golden background, and that's an early example. But this golden background eventually does become the norm for pieces like this. So it's really going to become very common to include a golden background instead of like a blue background that represents the sky. And early Christian artists begin to do that because they're seeking a means to conjure up a spiritual world before the eyes of the faithful. They're really wanting to move away from classical illusionism towards a more abstract style that really emphasizes the spiritual rather than the physical world. So they don't really care about making these pieces look supernatural or super realistic like the Romans or the Greeks did. They really want to create their own style that has more to do with the spiritual. And if they have to simplify the figures and add in unrealistic details, then that's what they'll do. And that's what they start doing. So next up, we'll take a look at another piece that's using that golden background, that more abstract style. And this is called Two Saints, detail from the mosaic frieze of the lower zone of the dome, the Church of St. George in Greece, northern Greece, late 4th or 5th century. So they're more advanced in form just because there's more detail, but they're also a century earlier than the mosaic that we just looked at of the loaves and fishes. So these are earlier. And this church was located in northern Greece, and it has a central plan layout, and it originally served as a mausoleum to the Roman Emperor Galerius. And he was actually a Caesar of the East under Diocletian. And the tomb actually resembles the tomb made for Diocletian in Diocletian's palace at Split. So eventually Christian architects converted this mausoleum into a church in the late 4th or 5th century. They added an apse, a narthex, which is basically a porch, and it covered the huge dome with 2 zones of mosaics. And so this is the lower band. The upper band is very poorly preserved. This one's not super well preserved either, but it's a little bit better than the upper band. And there are 8 pairs of over life-size figures of saints. So these are very large figures, over life size, and their arms are raised in prayer. They stand before like 2-story architectural fantasy landscapes that kind of resemble those Roman mural paintings that we saw earlier in the Roman chapter. And in this respect, these mosaics are definitely closely tied to the classical world because of the background being so similar to the Roman style mosaics, of that kind of fantasy architectural background. But they also are more Christian in that their garments are very flat. They're definitely stylized, so you can definitely see like some influence of Christianity coming in here, plus that golden background too. So definitely a new aesthetic is on exhibit here. It's really foreign to classical art. You know, classical art was really wrapped up with naturalism, illusionism, perspective, modeling in light, getting everything looking very natural. But this ethereal golden background suggests that these saints don't exist on earth, but in heaven, and are far above the heads of the Christian worshipers below. And this is precisely what the early Christian artists and mosaicists really were trying to get at, is that, they're not trying to make this supernatural like classical art. They're really defining their own iconography and their own style with this Christian art that's coming up. And there's definitely more of an emphasis on the spiritual than on the natural. And that basically kind of concludes the chapter. So yeah, we'll see you next time.